A little girl waited by the office trash bin, and what the CEO discovered left him speechless. It was nearly midnight when Marcus Whitmore, the notoriously private CEO of Whitmore and Lang, stepped off the executive elevator onto the 47th floor. The halls were quiet, bathed in the sterile blue light of motion-activated LEDs, and the only sound was the soft hum of the ventilation system. He had come back for a confidential document he'd forgotten in his office, something no assistant could be trusted with. As he passed the row of glass-walled departments, something caught his eye near the trash bin beside the printing room, a small figure, curled up, motionless. Marcus froze. It was a little girl. She looked no older than 6 or 7, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, knees pulled into her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. Her hair was in uneven braids, her clothes wrinkled and far too thin for the cold office air. A glittery backpack rested beside her, the kind school children carried. His pulse kicked up. This didn't make sense. No children were allowed in the building after hours. Security was strict, and yet there she was. "Hey!" His voice cracked from disuse and surprise. He took a slow step forward. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't move at first. Then, with the cautious grace of someone used to fear, she raised her head. Her eyes, dark, wide, and unspeakably sad, locked with his. Marcus felt something in his chest twist painfully. He didn't understand it, but he couldn't look away. "I was waiting," she said softly. Her voice was barely audible, but calm, too calm. He crouched down, still unsure if this was real. Waiting for who? She looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "My daddy." The silence that followed felt like it broke something invisible in the air. Marcus blinked. "What's your name?" She tilted her head slightly. "Ella." "Ella," he repeated, his throat dry. "And who's your daddy?" She stared at him, expression unreadable. Then she lifted her tiny hand and pointed, right at him. "You are." Marcus recoiled, as if struck. That couldn't be. He'd never. He would have known, wouldn't he? But her eyes, they looked familiar in a way that sent ice through his veins. He rose to his feet, backing away slightly, breath catching in his throat. This had to be a mistake, a prank, a cruel coincidence. But Ella stood, quietly brushing off her pants, and added with a strange finality, "You left us before I was born. Mommy said you didn't want to know." And in that moment, Marcus Whitmore, the man who built an empire through ruthless logic and airtight control, found himself utterly, irrevocably speechless. A single question thundered in his head. Was this possible? Marcus remained frozen, the weight of Ella's words crashing over him like a rogue wave. The sterile glass and steel world he had built suddenly felt hollow, fragile. He stared at the girl, at her trembling lower lip, the small nervous hands fidgeting with the strap of her glittery backpack. She wasn't scared of him, but she wasn't sure of him either. He crouched again, trying to find something solid to hold onto in this chaos. "Ella, how did you get up here?" he asked, voice softer now, searching her face for answers. She shrugged, eyes dropping. "The man at the front let me ride the elevator. I told him I was waiting for my daddy. I said you work here." She looked up again. "I saw your picture." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. That meant security had seen her. That meant this wasn't a hallucination. She wasn't just some lost child with a wild imagination. "How do you know me?" he asked carefully. Ella hesitated. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn photo. Her small fingers trembled as she handed it to him. He took it. It was a picture of him. Younger, 10, maybe 12 years ago, standing beside a woman he hadn't seen in a very long time. Julia. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Julia Morgan, his college girlfriend, the one who had left without saying goodbye. The one he had searched for nearly a year before giving up, thinking she had simply chosen a new life without him. He stared at the photo, his throat dry. Julia looked radiant, caught mid-laugh, her arm around his waist. And then he looked at Ella again. The eyes. the curve of her nose, the expression when she was concentrating. It was all there. He pressed the photo against his chest and leaned back on his heels, staring at the floor. "Your mother, does she know you're here?" Ella shook her head slowly. "She said you didn't care, but I wanted to see if that was true." The words were gentle, but they gutted him. Each syllable cut through layers of assumptions he'd lived with for over a decade. "She told me never to come find you," Ella continued, "but she cries when she thinks I'm asleep." Marcus felt something rise in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. Deep, blinding guilt. He had always wondered what happened to Julia, but not once had he considered this. A child. His child. He looked at Ella again, now sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, hugging her backpack to her chest. Did she tell you anything else about me?" he asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. Ella nodded. "She said you used to love music, that you played the piano, that when you smiled, you had a tiny scar near your lip from a dog bite." Marcus touched his upper lip unconsciously. "She noticed, and she said," Ella whispered, eyes shining now, "you were the kindest boy she ever met." That broke him. He didn't cry. Marcus Whitmore never cried. But in that moment, he had to turn away, hand over his mouth, breath catching in a silent storm of disbelief, grief, and something else he hadn't felt in decades. Longing. The office was too quiet. Every distant hum of the air vents, every flicker of fluorescent light, felt magnified now. Marcus stood slowly, the photograph still clutched tightly in his hand. Ella didn't speak. She simply watched him, waiting, measuring, as if this moment mattered more than she could express, and it did. He turned to face the massive windows that overlooked the city. The skyline glittered, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere deeper, older. Julia. The name echoed like a bell from a dream. He hadn't thought of her in years, not really. There were moments, certain smells, a familiar melody that brought her back, but never like this, never with a living, breathing little girl holding the pieces of their past in her small hands. A memory flashed in his mind. The last night he saw Julia. They had been sitting under a bridge near campus, talking about everything and nothing. She had cried when he told her he'd gotten the internship in New York. He'd promised it wouldn't change anything. But the next morning, she was gone. No note. No goodbye. He never understood why. He took a slow breath and turned back to Ella. "How long have you known that I might be your dad?" She looked down at her shoes. "Always." "Always?" "I asked once when I was 5. She showed me your picture, said your name, said you didn't want to be found." Her voice cracked slightly. "But I didn't believe her." Marcus felt the room shift again. His legs gave slightly as he sat down on the edge of the nearby bench, rubbing his forehead. It didn't add up. Julia had left. She had vanished. Why would she lie to her daughter like that? Why tell her he didn't care? Unless she had believed that herself. He looked at Ella, her small hands clenching the straps of her backpack, eyes heavy with something far too old for her age. "I didn't know," he whispered. "If I had, Ella, I swear, I never even knew she was pregnant." She didn't answer right away. Then, "I thought maybe, if you saw me, you'd remember." That hurt more than anything. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. He flipped it open to a weathered photo, faded from years of being pressed against paper. It was Julia, smiling. The same picture, taken the same day as the one Ella had given him. "I kept this," he said softly, "all this time." Ella came closer, peeking at the photo. Her voice trembled. "Mommy never smiled like that again." Marcus swallowed hard. Something wasn't right. Julia had left without explanation, told her daughter a lie. And now Ella was here alone in his office building. "Does your mum know where you are, Ella?" he asked again. She didn't answer. Her eyes welled up, and that's when he felt the shift, not just of emotion but of suspicion. Because Ella didn't run away. She was brought here. Or worse, sent. And Julia hadn't told her everything. Marcus stood abruptly, his heart beginning to pound in a different rhythm now. Not from emotion, but from instinct. A CEO's mind was trained to sense when something was off, and this wasn't adding up. "Ella," he said gently, crouching back down to her level. "I need to ask you something important, okay?" She nodded, eyes big and vulnerable. "Who brought you here? Did you come alone?" Her lips parted slightly, but then she bit down on them, unsure. She looked away. "Ella," he said again, firmer this time but still kind, "I need you to tell me. This is very important." She glanced toward the hallway that led to the elevators. "A lady brought me. She said she used to work here." Marcus's jaw tightened. "A lady? What was her name?" "I don't know," Ella whispered. "She had red hair. She said Mommy was sick and couldn't come. She said you'd help." He stood, walking toward the hallway windows, mind racing. There were a few women who matched that description over the years, but only one that made his stomach twist: Melissa Shaw. She was a former executive assistant, ambitious, meticulous, and quietly resentful when she'd been fired 5 years ago for leaking internal documents. She'd once been close to Julia. Very close, too close. And now this child shows up, claiming to be his daughter, dropped off by a woman who shouldn't even be near the building. Something was deeply wrong. Marcus walked to his office and picked up the internal phone. "Security," he said when the line picked up. "Who was at the front desk tonight?" The guard hesitated. I believe that was Jason, sir. Until 10. "Was there a woman with red hair who came through security tonight, accompanied by a child?" Another pause. "Yes, sir. Around 9:15. She said she had clearance from corporate for a personal delivery." Marcus's blood ran cold. "Did she leave?" Yes, she took the main elevator back down a few minutes after she arrived." So she had dropped Ella off and left. He turned back to the little girl sitting quietly near his desk now, looking impossibly small against the massive office backdrop. Someone had used her. "Ella." He sat across from her again. "Did the lady say anything else before she left?" "She said not to be scared," Ella murmured. "That you'd recognize me. That you'd remember Mommy. And she said—" She hesitated. "What did she say?" Ella met his eyes. "She said not to trust the people around you." Marcus stared at her, the words thudding in his chest like war drums. There was more to this, much more. And just as he began to speak again, the office door creaked open behind him. He turned and froze. It was Melissa, standing in the doorway, holding something small and wrapped in silk. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You weren't supposed to see her yet," she said coolly, "but I guess fate had other plans." Marcus stood between Ella and Melissa, his posture rigid, every instinct firing. The presence of his former assistant, here, unannounced and uninvited, reeked of something calculated, something cold. "What the hell are you doing here, Melissa?" he demanded. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked slowly into the room, the heels of her boots tapping against the floor like punctuation. Her eyes flicked to Ella, then back to Marcus. "I'm doing what should have been done years ago," she said, "making sure you finally face the truth." She held out the silk-wrapped object, placing it gently on the edge of his desk, like an offering. "You should open it." Marcus didn't move. Why now? Why her? Why bring a child into this? Melissa's voice didn't waver. "Because Julia's dying." The words sucked all the air from the room. "What?" "She has late-stage lymphoma," Melissa said quietly. "She didn't want you to know. Said you didn't deserve to. But Ella kept asking about you, kept digging through drawers, asking questions Julia couldn't answer anymore. And when I saw what was happening, I realized I couldn't stay silent." Marcus's eyes dropped to the silk bundle. Slowly, he unwrapped it. Inside was a locket, tarnished silver. He recognized it immediately. It was Julia's. He had given it to her in their second year of college. He opened it. One side had their photo cut to fit the frame. The other, a lock of baby hair pressed against a photo of a newborn. He stared at it, stunned. "She was going to tell you," Melissa said. "Once, but then she saw you on TV, giving some interview about legacy and ambition. She thought you'd moved on, that you wouldn't want to be tied to a life you didn't plan." Marcus felt his throat close. "She never gave me the chance," he said hoarsely. Melissa shrugged, her voice quiet now. She was scared. "And proud. And you?" he asked bitterly. "You just drop a child off like a package and vanish?" "I stayed nearby. I wasn't going to leave her alone. I just—" Melissa looked toward Ella. "She deserves to know where she came from. And maybe, just maybe, you deserve the chance to make it right." There was a silence that stretched long between them. Then Ella stood up and walked to Marcus, slipping her hand into his. It was so natural, so quiet, that it shattered something inside him. "I believe you now," she said simply. And then from the hallway another voice, one that Marcus hadn't heard in over a decade, frail, familiar, and laced with trembling emotion. "She shouldn't have had to find you alone." Marcus turned. His breath caught. Julia stood in the doorway, pale, thinner than he remembered, but unmistakably her. And her eyes, wet, shining, were locked on him. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. Julia's voice still hung in the air, delicate and fragile like the woman standing before him. Time had changed her. There were deep shadows under her eyes. Her cheeks were hollow, her once dark hair now streaked with grey. But her presence, it brought back 1,000 memories at once, memories he had locked away so carefully. She took one cautious step inside, her gaze never leaving his. Ella's small hand gripped Marcus's fingers tighter, but her eyes were on her mother now, wide, unsure. "Mummy?" she whispered. Julia smiled softly, her lips trembling. "I'm here, baby." "I thought you didn't come." "I couldn't leave her," Melissa said from behind. "She collapsed on the stairs. I brought her up as soon as she could walk again." Marcus still hadn't spoken. His heart was hammering so loudly in his chest he could barely hear. "Why?" he said finally, voice raw. "Why did you disappear?" Julia exhaled shakily. "Because I was scared." "Of me?" "No," she said quickly. "Of what I was becoming, of losing you while you rose to everything I knew you would be." He shook his head, stepping back, his hand still clasped around Ella's. "That doesn't make sense. We loved each other. You could have told me." "I was 19, Marcus," she said almost in a whisper. "You had your life mapped out, your career, your future. And I was pregnant, terrified and alone. My parents disowned me. I had nothing." "You had me," he shot back, louder than he meant. She flinched but didn't turn away. "You would have given up everything. I knew that. You would have stayed and hated yourself for not going." Marcus closed his eyes, chest heaving. The pain that surged inside him now wasn't just betrayal. It was grief. Grief for the years lost, for the birthdays missed, for the first steps, the first words, the sleepless nights he hadn't been there for. "I searched for you," he said. "For months. I know." "Then why not reach out later, years later?" "I was angry," she admitted, "at myself, at the world, at you for not finding me fast enough. By the time I wasn't angry anymore, it had been too long, and Ella was already old enough to ask questions I didn't know how to answer." She looked down at their daughter, so small between them, yet so strong. "I never stopped loving you," she added quietly. Marcus opened his eyes, and they were filled with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Raw vulnerability. He reached out almost involuntarily and touched Julia's wrist. She looked up, surprised by the gentleness in his eyes, and then Marcus said, barely above a whisper, "We have to talk. All of us." Julia nodded, but before anyone could speak again, Ella stepped forward, holding out a folded piece of paper. "I drew this," she said, her voice trembling, "in case you didn't believe me." Marcus took the paper and unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing of a tall man, a smiling woman, and a little girl between them, holding both their hands. Above it, in shaky letters, it read, "My real family." Marcus's knees almost buckled, and in that moment, he knew there would be no going back. The silence after Ella's drawing was deafening. Marcus stood there, the paper still in his hand, unable to stop staring at it. The image was simple, even childlike, but the message beneath it was unmistakably powerful. For Ella, this picture wasn't a fantasy. It was her truth, her hope, her proof. He finally looked up and saw Julia watching him, eyes glistening. She wasn't trying to manipulate him. There was no bitterness or demand in her gaze, only exhaustion, a quiet plea for understanding. "I showed her your picture last year," she said gently. "I told her about the locket, about how you used to talk about building a life that meant something. She started drawing you into everything. Birthday cards, classroom art, she always left space for you." Marcus pressed the paper against his chest, his voice a low tremble. "And all this time, you just let her believe I wouldn't want her." Julia winced. "No, I tried to protect her. I thought, if she hated you, maybe it would be easier when I—" Her voice cracked. She sat down heavily on the leather couch beside the windows, one hand clutching her chest, as if to hold something in place. Ella immediately ran to her, crawling into her lap and wrapping her arms tightly around her mother. Marcus was beside them in an instant, kneeling down. "What is it? Are you okay?" Julia nodded weakly, though her skin had turned pale again. "It comes and goes. The chemo didn't work the way we hoped. I've been hiding it from Ella, but she sees more than I want her to." Ella buried her face in Julia's neck, whispering, "I don't want you to go away." Julia rocked her gently, fingers stroking her hair. "I'm not leaving tonight. I'm still here." Marcus sat back, running a hand over his face. "So what now?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Julia met his eyes again, this time with clarity. "Now you know that's what I came for, not to ask for anything, not to sue or guilt you. Just so you wouldn't go through life not knowing you had a daughter who wanted you." She looked down at Ella. "She needed you." Marcus turned to the child in her arms, who peeked up at him with wide, tear-streaked eyes. "I still do," she whispered. He leaned forward slowly, placing a hand gently on Ella's back. "You have me. I promise you, Ella. You have me now." Ella's face lit up in a way that crushed him completely. She looked at her mother, as if needing permission. Julia nodded through her tears. "It's okay, baby. You can trust him." Ella moved into Marcus's arms without hesitation, wrapping herself around his neck with surprising strength. He held her, stunned by how natural it felt, how right. "I've missed so much," he murmured. "And there's still so much you can have," Julia whispered. He looked at her, but before he could speak again, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the moment. Melissa stepped forward, her face suddenly alert. She picked up the device, frowned, and looked at Marcus. "It's your legal team," she said, confusion in her voice. "They say someone's filed an emergency petition against you, something about paternity and guardianship." Marcus stood slowly, still holding Ella, his face hardening. "Who?" Melissa checked the caller ID, then locked eyes with him. "Your father." Marcus felt the name hit him like a fist. His father. The very man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 8 years. The man who had built the original Whitmore fortune through ice-cold business moves, unyielding control, and merciless expectations. The man who had once told Marcus, after the death of his mother, "Sentimentality is a weakness. Success doesn't grieve." He stared at Melissa, stunned. What the hell does he have to do with this? She held the phone out to him, but he didn't take it. "They said a petition was filed 30 minutes ago. He's accusing you of withholding a child that may be related to the family. He's requesting immediate guardianship proceedings to—" She hesitated. "Remove the child from any emotionally compromised environment." Julia gasped softly from the couch. "What?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "He thinks he can take her from me, from us." Ella clung to his neck, her voice muffled but urgent. "I don't want to go with anyone else." "You won't," Marcus said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. I promise you, no one is taking you anywhere. Julia stood shakily but with resolve. Why would he do this? He never cared about your life. He certainly wouldn't care about mine. Marcus swallowed hard. He doesn't care about people. He cares about legacy, about bloodlines. If he knows Ella is mine, he'll want her in the family system. Raised like I was. Controlled. Molded. Cold. Melissa, who had once worked closely with the elder Whitmore, looked at Marcus gravely. He'll argue that you're not fit to make decisions right now, that your judgment is compromised by the sudden emotional shock. Marcus turned and walked to the window, breathing heavily, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a map he no longer recognized. This wasn't just about reconnecting with Julia. It wasn't just about finding Ella. It was a war, a battle for a future that had barely begun. He looked back at Julia. We have to fight this. She nodded. Then we fight. No, he corrected himself, taking her hand and glancing down at Ella. We win. But the weight of what that would mean pressed down on him like a storm. His father had endless legal resources, power, connections in every courtroom in the state. If he wanted custody, even temporary, he might get it, unless Marcus could prove something deeper, something irrefutable. Melissa, he said sharply, call my private legal team, not the company's. Tell them to start a full background file on Julia's medical records, Ella's school history, everything. I want to be ready before sunrise. She nodded and stepped out to make the call. Julia looked up at him, the fire back in her eyes despite her frailty. He doesn't get to win, not this time. Marcus reached out and cupped her cheek gently. He doesn't. But he'll try. Then he turned back to his desk, his mind racing. He had always believed his greatest fight would be for his company. But now he realized his real legacy was this: Ella, Julia, and no one, not even his father, was going to take that away. The hours between midnight and dawn passed like a tense, waking dream. Marcus transformed his office into a war room, papers strewn across the desk, his personal attorney on speakerphone, Melissa scanning court filings with sharp focus. Julia sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, Ella curled against her side, both of them silent but alert, watching the world around them change. At 4:17 a.m., the fax machine lit up with the first official document, a notarized emergency petition for temporary guardianship, filed by Richard Whitmore. Marcus read the words, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The language was clear. Concern over the child's sudden introduction into a volatile environment under the care of an emotionally compromised parent with no legal acknowledgement or prior custody arrangement. This is a move of control, Marcus muttered. He's leveraging the fact that Ella's not yet legally recognized as mine. Julia stood shakily and walked to his side. Then we need to fix that, right now. Marcus looked at her, surprised. You'd agree to that? I should have done it years ago, she said. But if it protects her, if it protects you both, then yes. Put my name on the record. Let's make it real. He stepped forward and pulled her into a firm embrace. It was always real. Even when I didn't know. They didn't need to say more. By 5 a.m., the private legal team had arranged for a judge to review an emergency acknowledgement of paternity request. Julia gave her full consent. The lawyers prepared every document needed to establish Marcus as Ella's legal father, within hours. But there was one more thing Marcus needed: proof that his father's interest wasn't about protection, it was about power. Melissa, Marcus said, motioning her over. You worked with him for 5 years. Do you remember any moments, emails, meetings, where he hinted at taking over the family image, about rebuilding the Whitmore name through bloodlines? She nodded. Yes. Especially after your mother passed. He became obsessed with legacy, said your refusal to marry or have children was a stain on the Whitmore name. He once told me the only way to clean it was to raise the next generation himself. Marcus's eyes darkened, and now he thinks Ella's his way in. Melissa searched through an old email archive she still had access to. After 20 minutes, she found it, a cryptic message from Richard Whitmore to a private investigator, dated a year ago. "If he won't build the next heir, I'll find it myself. He doesn't get to decide the family's future." It was enough. Enough to show that this wasn't about a child's welfare, but control, manipulation, and ego. As the sun began to rise, golden light spilled into the office, bathing the weary figures inside. Marcus stood by the window, holding Ella's hand as she watched the sky change colors. "Do you have to go to court?" she asked softly. "Not today," he replied, "but soon. I have to make sure you stay with the people who love you." She leaned into his side. "You mean us?" He smiled, the first true one he'd felt in days. "Yes, us." But just as the warmth of morning settled in, Marcus's assistant buzzed the intercom. "Sir, there's someone here. He says he's your father. He's demanding a meeting." "Now." Marcus's smile vanished. He turned toward the door, jaw set. "Let him in." The door opened with the smooth hiss of hydraulic hinges, and in stepped Richard Whitmore, tall, immaculately dressed, every inch the patriarch he'd always styled himself to be, grey hair swept back, custom-tailored suit, polished shoes that echoed on the hardwood floor with every step. But it wasn't just his appearance that commanded attention, it was the chill that followed him. The same cold gravity that had once made boardrooms go silent. His eyes landed on Marcus first, calculating, unsmiling. Then they shifted to Julia, and finally, to Ella. A beat passed. Then he offered a cool, rehearsed smile. "So, the rumors are true." Marcus stepped in front of Ella instinctively. "You have no right to be here." Richard's tone was casual, but his words razor-sharp. "I filed within my rights as a concerned party. A child's welfare, especially one carrying our bloodline, isn't a matter for secrecy." "You're not here out of concern," Marcus said. "You're here because you see an heir, a name, not a person." Richard's expression didn't change. "Legacy matters, Marcus. You used to understand that, until you became obsessed with independence and ideology. This child is the future of our family. She should be raised with discipline, standards, structure." Julia's voice cut in. "She's not a trophy." Richard turned to her slowly. "And you're not part of this family." "Maybe not," she said, chin lifted. "But she is, and she's not yours to control." He walked closer, slow and methodical. Ella gripped Marcus's hand tighter but didn't back away. "She's a child," Richard said, nodding toward her. "Children need protection, direction. They don't need to be raised by the woman who ran away and the man who didn't know she existed." Marcus's voice was low, steady. "You're not taking her." "I've got no legal claim yet," Richard replied, "but I have money, power, and decades of reputation in this city. Do you really want a public battle that drags this child's name through the courts?" Marcus didn't blink. "If it means protecting her from you, then yes, I'll fight you. Every day in every court until she's old enough to see what kind of man you really are." Richard took another step forward. "Be careful, son. You don't want to escalate a war you can't win." But before Marcus could respond, a small voice rang out from behind him. "I don't want to go with you." They all turned. Ella stepped out from behind Marcus, standing on her own, her small hands balled into fists. "I don't know you," she said, voice trembling. "And I don't want to know you." Richard's face shifted for the first time. Just a flicker, a brief moment of something between surprise and insult. Marcus looked at him squarely. "You heard her." The older man straightened his cuffs, then turned toward the door. "This isn't over." As he left, silence fell over the room again. Ella climbed into Julia's lap. Marcus stood at the window, watching his father's car pull away from the building. Julia looked at him, pale but determined. "He's not going to stop." "I know," Marcus said. He turned back to them. "But neither am I." Marcus hadn't slept. The confrontation with his father lingered in his mind like a venom he couldn't spit out. The man had walked in as if he still owned Marcus's life, still believed he could bend futures to his will with a threat and a signature. But this time, he was wrong. Marcus sat alone at the long glass conference table, just as the first real light of morning flooded the room. The rest of the city was waking up, but his world had already changed. On the table in front of him lay 2 documents: Ella's emergency paternity acknowledgement, notarized just before dawn, and Julia's handwritten consent for full joint custody. Both now filed. It was official. Ella was his daughter, legally, publicly, and the Whitmore family name, his father's precious legacy, now included a little girl with bright eyes, uneven braids, and the kind of strength Richard would never understand. Marcus exhaled deeply, but the peace was fleeting. Because Richard had promised this wasn't over, and Richard Whitmore never made idle threats. The elevator doors opened behind him. Melissa entered, her expression grave. "We just got word," she said. "Your father filed a second motion." Marcus looked up, tension already climbing. "For what?" "Emergency injunction. He's claiming Julia is medically unfit to retain custody and that you are unstable due to emotional compromise. He's asking for Ella to be placed in temporary care with a third party appointed by the court." Marcus stood up, anger boiling beneath the surface. "He wants to strip us both." "He's moving fast," Melissa said. "Too fast. He knew you'd file paternity last night. That motion was pre-written." Marcus rubbed his temples. "So he's been preparing this, waiting for the right time to strike." Melissa nodded. "And he thinks your love for Ella will slow you down, that you'll hesitate, that you'll panic." Marcus walked to the windows, watching the city buzz below. Then he turned. "He doesn't understand what love actually does to a man like me." He picked up his phone and called the head of his private legal team. "I want an emergency hearing set. This week, I want the best child advocacy lawyer in the state, on retainer by noon." He hung up and looked at Melissa. "Get Julia's medical records. We need to prove she's receiving care and that she's still capable of parenting. Then I want an independent evaluation for me. Psychological, emotional, the works. We're going to flood that court with evidence." Melissa nodded, already making notes. He looked down the hall toward his office, where Julia and Ella were resting. And in his heart he made a silent vow. "I wasn't there when you were born, but I'm here now, and I will never let anyone take you away from me, not even him." The next 48 hours moved like a storm, fast and unforgiving. Julia had agreed to everything. Blood tests, doctor's visits, evaluations, interviews. Marcus insisted on it, not because he doubted her, but because he refused to give Richard even the smallest crack to exploit. Ella stayed with them at Marcus's penthouse, where the staff quickly transformed a guest room into a quiet, pastel-colored sanctuary. For the first time in her life, she had her own space with her name stitched into the bedding. But even with toys, new pajamas, and warm meals, she asked the same question every night. "What if he takes me?" And every night, Marcus answered the same way, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. "He won't. Not while I'm breathing." But the day before the hearing, something unexpected happened. Julia collapsed in the hallway. Marcus caught her before she hit the ground, his arms cradling her limp frame as Melissa called for the driver and rushed them to the hospital. At the emergency room, the attending physician pulled Marcus aside. "She's weaker than she let on. Her white blood cell count is dangerously low, and she's been hiding symptoms: fatigue, fever, pain." Marcus looked through the small glass window at Julia, who lay pale and unmoving in the hospital bed. Ella sat beside her, clutching her mother's hand with both of hers, whispering stories about her drawings. "She didn't tell me," Marcus said, swallowing hard. "She promised she'd say something if it got worse." "She didn't want you to change your mind," the doctor replied gently. "Some parents try to hold everything together until they know their child is safe." Melissa arrived a moment later with a folder full of legal documents. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. Marcus took her into the hallway. She opened the folder. "Your father's attorney filed a motion to submit Julia's hospitalization as evidence of unfitness today. He found out within hours." Marcus's hands clenched. "He's watching us every move. Worse," she said. "He's framing this as negligence, that you kept Julia out of professional care to delay court proceedings and manipulate public sympathy." It was a lie, but a smart one. Marcus leaned against the wall, the air thick around him. His empire had prepared him for everything: hostile takeovers, public scandal, betrayal. But not this. Not the helplessness of watching a woman he once loved fade, and the child they shared hang in the balance. He turned and looked through the window again. Ella had fallen asleep beside her mother. Julia's hand was still wrapped around hers. "She doesn't have time for a drawn-out legal war," Marcus whispered. "No," Melissa said quietly. "And if she's hospitalized during the hearing, your father's lawyers will tear through her absence like wolves." There was a long pause. Then Marcus straightened. "Then she won't be absent." "What are you thinking?" He looked her in the eyes. "We're not just going to fight him with evidence. We're going to fight him with truth. Julia's going to speak, in her own words. If she's too weak to testify in person, we'll film her." Melissa hesitated. "That's risky." "It's real," Marcus said, "and that's what the court needs to see. Not documents, not numbers, her, what she's been through, what she's given to protect Ella." He looked back through the glass one more time, and what she's still willing to give. They set up the camera the next morning in the hospital room. The lighting was soft and natural, filtered through thin white curtains that barely held back the rising sun. A nurse helped adjust Julia's pillows, raising her just enough to keep her upright without straining. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that made you think of winter. But her eyes were steady. Marcus sat beside her, holding her hand. The camera light blinked red. She looked into the lens and took a breath. "My name is Julia Morgan," she began, voice raspy but clear. "I'm the mother of Ella Morgan, and this is what I want the court to know." No script, no notes, just truth. "I met Marcus Whitmore in college. We were young, in love. But when I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I ran. Not because I didn't love him, but because I was scared he would give up everything for me. And I couldn't live with that kind of guilt." She paused, her eyes glistening, but she didn't break. "I was wrong. I should have told him. I should have trusted him to make his own choices. But I didn't, and for years I carried that weight alone." She turned slightly toward Marcus. "He didn't know about Ella. He never had the chance, but from the moment he found out, he didn't run. He stayed. He protected us. He's been a father to her in every way that matters." She looked back at the camera. "I am dying." The words hung in the air like a final chord in a song no one wanted to end. "I've known for a while. I've tried to hide it for Ella's sake. But I know I don't have long. And before I go, I need to make sure my daughter is safe. Not in a mansion, not with a name, not with money. With love." Her hand squeezed Marcus's. "She belongs with her father, with the man who reads to her at night, even when he's exhausted, the man who holds her hand through hospital visits, the man who tells her the truth even when it hurts." Another pause. Deeper now. Her voice dropped. "She does not belong with a man who sees her as a symbol, or a legacy, or a tool. Richard Whitmore may share blood with her, but he does not share a heart." Her jaw trembled, but her voice didn't. "I ask this court. I beg. Let my daughter stay where she is loved." She closed her eyes. Melissa stepped in and turned off the camera. The room fell silent, except for the soft beeping of machines and Ella's quiet breathing in the chair nearby. Marcus leaned forward and kissed Julia's hand. "You were perfect." "I just hope it's enough," she whispered. He nodded. "It will be." But even as he said it, his mind raced, because he knew his father would see that video, not as a plea, but as a threat. And Richard Whitmore always destroyed his threats. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived cloaked in tension. The courthouse was surrounded by a light fog, the kind that seemed to mute the world. Marcus arrived with Ella holding tightly to his hand, dressed in a navy blue dress with a white bow Julia had picked out for her 2 days before. Melissa walked beside them, clutching the portfolio of evidence, including the video they had recorded. But Julia wasn't with them. She was still in the hospital, too weak to leave her bed. Marcus had tried to convince her to stay uninvolved, to rest, to focus on the time she had left. but she had insisted that her words be seen, her story heard. Inside the courtroom, Richard Whitmore was already seated. He looked exactly the same, controlled, polished, unmoved. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through a stack of prepared notes. As Marcus entered, Richard stood briefly, offering a cold nod, then looked down at Ella. A faint smile curved his lips. It wasn't kind. It was possessive. Protective custody agents waited by the door, standard in high-conflict custody disputes. If the judge ruled in Richard's favor, they could be ordered to escort Ella out of the room. Marcus felt Ella's hand tighten around his. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled into a tight bun, entered the chamber. "We're here today regarding the emergency petition for guardianship over minor child Ella Morgan," she began. "Petitioner, Richard Whitmore. Respondents, Marcus Whitmore and Julia Morgan." As opening statements began, Marcus barely heard the opposing counsel's words. They painted him as emotionally unstable, reacting recklessly to a sudden emotional upheaval, unable to provide a stable environment for a child in crisis. Julia was portrayed as terminal and negligent for not notifying the father earlier. The case, they argued, was too uncertain, too risky. Richard sat like a statue, arms crossed, gaze fixed ahead. Then it was their turn. Melissa stood with quiet fire and laid out the facts. Marcus had legally acknowledged paternity. Julia had signed full joint custody. Ella was thriving under their care. And most importantly, there was video testimony. The judge allowed the video. Every second of Julia's voice filled the courtroom with something undeniable. Truth. Even Richard looked away during part of it. When it ended, the judge leaned back, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "This court finds the evidence of parental acknowledgement compelling and Ms. Morgan's statement deeply moving." But then, Richard's attorney stood again. "We'd like to call one final witness." Melissa froze. "There was no witness listed in your filing," she snapped. "We're within our right under emergency review," the attorney said. "The witness is present." The judge allowed it. A woman entered the courtroom. Marcus's heart sank the moment he saw her. Sandra Liu, a former nanny Julia had hired years ago, during the month she was too sick to care for Ella full-time. Marcus had never met her, but Julia had mentioned her once, briefly, and never warmly. Sandra took the stand, eyes lowered. And then she looked at the judge and said clearly, "I witnessed emotional instability, episodes where Ms. Morgan would scream at nothing, leave Ella alone for hours. I once had to take the child to urgent care myself because her fever was ignored." Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus shot to his feet. "That's a lie," the judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Whitmore, control yourself." Sandra continued, her voice smooth now, rehearsed. "I don't believe she's fit to raise a child, and I fear Mr. Whitmore, by extension, may be enabling her." Marcus sat back down slowly, rage in his chest, because now he saw the plan. Richard hadn't just built a legal case, he'd built a story, and now the court was listening. The judge called for a 15-minute recess. As soon as the courtroom doors closed, Marcus turned to Melissa with fire in his eyes. "She's lying! That woman, Sandra! She's lying through her teeth." "I know," Melissa said, already typing furiously into her phone. "We need proof. Documentation. Anything that contradicts her testimony." "I want everything on her," Marcus said. "Every job, every reference, every complaint she's ever had. If my father paid her to say this—" "He did," came a voice behind them. It was quiet, but full of certainty. Julia's doctor stood there out of breath, still wearing her hospital badge. "I'm sorry to barge in," she said, glancing around, "but I couldn't let this go on." Marcus stared at her. "Dr. Fenwick?" She nodded. "Julia asked me to bring a file, a sealed one. She didn't want it released unless it came to this." She handed him an envelope. Inside were medical notes, specific, dated, and detailed. Doctors' observations about Julia's physical and mental health, Ella's pediatric records, and, most crucially, entries that documented Sandra Liu's behavior. One note stood out. Nanny Sandra Liu terminated after 2 weeks due to inappropriate isolation practices and negligence in administering fever medication. Melissa's eyes lit up. This is gold. Get it copied, Marcus said. We submit it the second we're back in. They returned to the courtroom just as the judge re-entered. Marcus requested to approach the bench with supplemental evidence. Permission granted. Melissa handed over the file. The judge read silently, her brow furrowed. Then she looked up sharply at Sandra. Ms. Liu, you testified under oath that Ms. Morgan neglected her child and left her in your care during critical medical moments. Yes, Sandra said confidently. The judge held up the file. Then can you explain why this hospital file states you were terminated for negligence and inappropriate behavior while under my jurisdiction as court-approved care staff? Sandra blanched. That wasn't... Were you or were you not dismissed from your position after 2 weeks due to endangering a child's health? The judge asked, her voice now like steel. Sandra fumbled. I may have... Yes or no, Ms. Liu? Yes. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge turned to Richard's legal team. This court does not tolerate false testimony, especially in a case involving a child's welfare. Consider this your warning. Any further misleading evidence will result in sanctions. Richard shifted for the first time, his jaw visibly tightening. The judge turned back to the room. I've heard enough. Everyone held their breath. Effective immediately, Marcus Whitmore is granted full joint custody of Ella Morgan, with legal acknowledgement of paternity now affirmed and protected under emergency order. Julia Morgan retains custodial rights until further notice, pending medical evaluations, but this court recognizes her as a loving, competent parent. Marcus exhaled sharply, eyes misting. Ella, sitting beside him, looked up in confusion. Does that mean... He turned and smiled through the tears. You're not going anywhere. But even as they embraced, a quiet chill returned to the room, because Richard stood slowly from his seat. Calm, composed. And as he passed Marcus, he leaned in just enough to whisper, "This isn't the end, it's just the first round." The courtroom battle was over, for now, but Marcus knew better than to believe the war had ended. Richard Whitmore never played a single game. He played long games, decades if needed, and losing in court was never part of his plan. It was just a calculated delay, a redirection. That night, Marcus returned home with Julia and Ella. The city lights blinked below as they settled into the penthouse, but the air inside felt different now. Not heavy with tension, but not quite light either. It was the calm between waves. Julia was back from the hospital under supervised outpatient care. She was frail but present, her voice softer, her steps slower, but Ella didn't leave her side. At one point, Marcus watched them on the balcony. Ella wrapped in a blanket, sitting in her mother's lap, both staring out over the city as if it were a foreign land. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at a manila envelope Melissa had handed him before she left for the evening. "Background on your father's holdings," she'd said. "You'll want to read it." He hadn't opened it yet, because part of him didn't want to see how deep the manipulation went. Julia entered the room quietly, sitting across from him. She looked at the envelope, then at him. "Still think he's done?" He shook his head. "Not even close." "What's next?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted, "but he won't try to take Ella directly again. Not through the courts. That door's closed now." Julia tilted her head. "Then what?" Marcus hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside were financial reports, property holdings, and most surprising of all, a series of silent investments in family advocacy groups, think tanks, and social campaigns focused on ethical guardianship. "He's shaping a narrative," Marcus said slowly, reading the headers. "Funding media that questions corporate parents, single mothers, emotional instability as a liability." Julia's eyes widened. "He's creating a cultural story that aligns with his claim." "Exactly," Marcus said. "If he can't win in court, he'll win in the court of public opinion. He'll make it look like I'm unstable, reckless, Emotionally compromised. And you, a dying woman making desperate choices, she finished, the bitterness in her voice unmistakable. He's not attacking us now, Marcus said. He's attacking the ground we stand on. She leaned back, taking it in. We need to go public. He looked at her, surprised. You hate media. I do, she said. But if he's going to try and make us into a story, then we tell our version first. Marcus considered it, a controlled interview, a profile on Ella's story, her drawing, the video testimony, not for pity, but to anchor the truth before the storm hit. I'll call a journalist I trust, he said. We'll do it our way, no scripts, just our story. She nodded, but her expression was troubled. There's one more thing you should know. What? Julia reached into her coat and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed at the edges. He sent this to me 2 years ago, she said. I never told you because I didn't want to reopen the wound. Marcus took it, unfolding it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richards, it wasn't a threat, it was a deal. If the child is ever acknowledged, I'll take her in. You'll be free, and I'll ensure she becomes everything Marcus never had the discipline to be. Marcus stood so fast the chair nearly toppled behind him. He planned this before she ever found me. Julia nodded. He was just waiting. And Marcus knew then this wasn't just about control or legacy. It was about revenge. His father was going to destroy everything Marcus built, unless he moved first. The next morning, Marcus stood in front of the towering glass windows of his office, watching the city pulse with its usual rhythm, fast, hungry, distracted. But he wasn't distracted. Not anymore. He was planning. The letter from his father sat on the table behind him like a loaded weapon, its contents etched into his mind. Richard had offered Julia a future without Marcus, a twisted kind of freedom. And now that offer had failed, he was resorting to the next tactic: public perception, image, influence. So Marcus decided to fight where it hurt most: the Whitmore name. At 8 a.m., he met with a journalist named Rachel Huxley, an award-winning reporter with a reputation for integrity and a sharp moral compass. She had once exposed a major tech CEO for covering up child labor practices. Marcus had funded her non-profit years ago, anonymously. Now he needed her help. They met in a quiet office lounge, a secure space with no cameras or press leaks. I've heard whispers, Rachel said, setting her recorder on the table but not pressing play yet. Your father's suddenly a patron saint of child welfare. Very off-brand. Marcus leaned forward. Because it's not about children. It's about control. He laid out everything: Julia's illness, Ella's arrival, the court battle, the forged testimony. And finally, the letter, proof that Richard had tried to circumvent Marcus entirely by targeting Julia with a bribe disguised as a solution. Rachel listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back and stared at him. And why now? She asked. Why break the silence you've guarded for your entire career? He looked down for a moment, then back up. Because there's a little girl sleeping in my home who draws pictures of a family she just met. Because there's a woman who gave up everything to protect that child. And because someone is trying to rewrite their story into something dark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Ella's crayon drawing, the one she'd given him that night in the office. This is real, he said. More real than any boardroom or brand I've ever built. Rachel studied the drawing, then met his eyes again. I'll do it, she said. But if I take this story, I don't hold back. That includes you, the absence, the late discovery, the pain you didn't even know you caused. I expect nothing less, he said. They recorded for over an hour. Julia joined by phone near the end, her voice calm but powerful. She didn't beg for sympathy. She spoke of motherhood, of loss, of guilt, and of hope. Ella, still sleepy in her pajamas, wandered into the room and asked if she could say something too. Rachel, surprised but open, said yes. Into the mic, in a small, clear voice, Ella said, I didn't come here to make trouble. I came to find my daddy. Rachel blinked hard, turned off the recorder and whispered, That's your headline. Marcus stood as she packed up. How long until it runs? "24 hours," she said. "Maybe less, and I promise you, when it does, people will know the truth before your father can spin it." As she left, Marcus turned back to the city, feeling something shift inside him. Not just the need to fight, but the desire to build, to protect, to love. Ella had cracked open something in him, something long buried beneath ambition. And now, for the first time, he was ready to live for more than a legacy. He was ready to live for her. The article went live at 5:06 p.m. The headline hit social media like a lightning strike. CEO Marcus Whitmore breaks silence, a daughter, a battle, and the truth his father tried to bury. By 5:30 it was trending. By 6 Square it had over 1.2 million views. Marcus sat on the living room couch with Ella curled up beside him, watching the coverage unfold on a muted television. Julia rested in the bedroom, too tired to sit through another media cycle, though she'd squeezed his hand before drifting to sleep. The article was raw, intimate, and unflinching. It didn't hide Marcus's silence or his mistakes, but it didn't hide Richard's lies either. It detailed the forged testimony, the guardianship filing, the unethical pressure placed on a dying woman. And most powerfully, it included a brief video clip from Julia's hospital message. "If I die, I want my daughter to remember one thing, that she was wanted, by me, by her father, from the moment she was born." The world responded. Thousands of comments flooded in. Parents who'd fought custody battles, adoptees who'd searched for birth parents, children of divorce who knew the ache of uncertainty. But the tone was not scandal. It was solidarity. And then came the counterstrike. At 7:12 p.m., Richard Whitmore's legal team released a statement. Mr. Richard Whitmore stands by his commitment to child welfare. While he does not wish to escalate a family matter, he regrets that Mr. Marcus Whitmore has chosen to involve the media in a personal dispute. Out of respect for the minor child involved, Mr. Whitmore will be withdrawing from public comment, but reserves the right to pursue all appropriate legal avenues. Marcus read the statement 3 times. It was calculated. A retreat, but not a surrender. He looked at Melissa, who had come over after seeing the article explode online. She stood near the kitchen, arms folded. "He's playing the long game," she said. "He knows if he pushes now, it looks like retaliation. But if he waits 6 months, a year until the public forgets, he'll try again." Marcus nodded. "Then we stay ahead of him." "How?" "By building a life that no one can challenge. Not the courts, not the media, not him." He looked down at Ella, who had fallen asleep again, her head on his shoulder. It wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about building something real, stable, permanent, a home. He stood slowly and carried Ella down the hall, gently tucking her into the new bed she'd begun to call mine. Then he walked to the bedroom where Julia slept and sat beside her. She stirred. "Did it work?" "Yes," he whispered, "but it's not over." She opened her eyes. "Is it ever?" He shook his head. "Probably not." She reached for his hand. "Then let's make the most of what we have." They sat in silence, the weight of the day pressing against them. But beneath it, something softer had begun to bloom. Marcus had spent his whole life chasing perfection. Now, for the first time, he was learning the power of something else: presence. The days that followed moved differently, slower, quieter, richer. Marcus began working from home more often. His schedule no longer dictated solely by stock indexes or quarterly reports, but by Ella's school pickup, Julia's medical appointments, and, on Wednesdays, family art night, which Ella insisted on hosting in the living room. There were still phone calls from lawyers, still murmurs in the boardroom about the damage the article might have done. But Marcus didn't care. Not anymore. He had stepped out of the tower and into the life he never knew he needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the penthouse in golden hues, Marcus found himself at the kitchen counter, slicing apples the way Ella liked them, thin, with no skin. She sat at the dining table with colored pencils, drawing something intently. He walked over and peeked. "What are you working on?" She grinned. "It's our family tree." He looked down. At the base of the trunk, She had drawn herself. Above her, Marcus and Julia side by side, and off to the corner, she had drawn a dark, gnarled branch separated from the rest, a figure in grey with a question mark over his head. "That's your grandpa?" Marcus asked. She nodded solemnly. "I didn't know where to put him. He feels like a storm." Marcus didn't answer at first. He simply sat beside her and looked at the drawing. "You don't have to make space for people who make you feel unsafe," he said finally. "Not even if they're family." Ella looked up at him. "Is it okay if I cut his branch off?" He smiled. "It's your tree." She carefully erased the branch. Later that night, Julia joined him on the balcony. She had just finished a round of treatment and looked exhausted but radiant in the moonlight. She leaned against the railing, her blanket around her shoulders. "She erased him," Marcus said. "I know." She didn't ask permission. She just knew. "She's brave," Julia whispered. "More than I ever was." He turned to her. "Are you brave? You are brave." She looked at him, a slow smile spreading. "You really believe that?" "I do." She hesitated. "There's something I haven't told you." He waited. "The doctors said I have options. It's experimental, risky, but there's a chance." Marcus's heart caught. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I didn't want to give you hope unless I believed in it too." He stepped closer. "And now, I believe." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the city sparkled around them. "I'll be with you," he said. "Through all of it." "I know." Inside, Ella's laughter echoed down the hall, chasing away the weight of so many silent years. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Marcus Whitmore realized this wasn't just a chapter, it was the beginning of everything that mattered. The next morning came with an unexpected knock at the door. It was early, barely past sunrise, and the world outside was still quiet. Marcus was in the kitchen making coffee when he heard it. 3 deliberate knocks, not rushed, not tentative, certain. He walked to the door, opened it, and froze. A man stood there, older, tired-looking, dressed simply. It was Gregory Hale, his mother's former attorney, and the only person Marcus had ever trusted outside of his own circle. He hadn't seen him in over a decade. "Gregory?" Marcus asked, confused. What are you doing here?" "I came as soon as I read the article," Gregory said, stepping inside with a briefcase clutched in his hand. "I have something your mother left behind. She asked me not to deliver it unless—" He paused. "Unless Richard tried to take your child." Marcus's heart dropped. "She knew?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "She suspected," Gregory replied. "Even back then." They moved to the dining table. Marcus opened the briefcase and pulled out a small sealed envelope. It was aged but intact. His mother's handwriting danced across the front. "For Marcus, when you need to protect what you love." His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were 2 items. A handwritten letter from his mother, explaining that she had once overheard Richard speak to his own attorney about safeguarding the family legacy at any cost. She had feared he would one day try to control any grandchildren the way he had controlled Marcus. A signed, notarized statement of intent that if Marcus ever became a father, she supported his full custodial authority, regardless of marital status or circumstances. Gregory leaned forward. "It won't carry the weight of law, but in the court of opinion, in the story you're building, it's a hammer." Marcus stared down at his mother's writing, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. She had died thinking she failed him, but even in her absence she had been protecting him, preparing him. And now her voice, quiet and fierce, was back. He looked at Gregory. "Thank you. I don't know how to—" "You don't have to," the older man said. "Just use it. Finish what she couldn't." As Gregory left, Julia entered the room, already dressed in soft grey and leaning on the edge of the doorframe. She could see something had changed. Marcus held up the letter. My mother left this for me. For us. Julia came closer, reading it over his shoulder. She knew, she whispered. He nodded. She knew what kind of man my father was, and what I'd need to be if I ever had a family. Julia rested her head on his shoulder. You're becoming that man, she said quietly. Ella ran into the room a moment later, barefoot, holding a stuffed bear. Daddy, do I have to go to school today? He knelt down, pulling her into a hug. No, he said. Today, we stay home. He looked up at Julia. Together. And as the morning sun broke through the windows, casting warmth across their table and the long shadows behind them, Marcus felt something rise inside him. Not fear, not revenge, resolve. Because this wasn't just about surviving his father's war. It was about ending it. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in the same courtroom where everything had started. But this time, he wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to finish what his mother had started. The hearing was closed to the public by special request. No press, no photographers. Just Marcus, Julia, Ella, and Richard. The judge looked down at the new petition filed by Marcus's legal team. Mr. Whitmore, she said, you're requesting a permanent injunction against your father, a legal boundary that would prevent him from seeking guardianship, interfering with custody, or initiating contact with your daughter, present or future. That's a significant measure. Yes, Your Honor, Marcus said calmly, standing beside Julia, because my father's interest in my daughter is not familial. It's strategic, it's manipulative, and it's harmful. Richard sat across the aisle, silent, flanked by his attorney. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something unfamiliar, resignation, or perhaps the first glimmer of regret. Melissa stepped forward and presented the court with the documentation. Not just legal motions and medical reports, but the newly submitted affidavit from Marcus's late mother, evidence from beyond the grave. The judge took her time reading it. Marcus felt Julia's fingers tighten around his. Ella sat quietly between them, drawing on a notepad. Occasionally she looked up, her eyes darting toward the man who had tried to take her. She no longer looked afraid, just distant. As if he no longer meant anything at all. Finally the judge looked up. I've reviewed the statement provided by the late Mrs. Whitmore. It is, without question, unusual, but deeply compelling. It aligns with a pattern we've now seen demonstrated in court multiple times. She turned to Richard. Do you wish to respond? Richard rose slowly, his movements deliberate. The courtroom waited. I have nothing further to say, he said, his voice quiet. A beat of silence. Then the judge nodded once. Very well. This court hereby grants the injunction. Richard Whitmore is legally barred from initiating custody, guardianship, or visitation proceedings involving Ella Morgan. He is further ordered to cease all direct or indirect contact with the minor and her immediate family. This decision is final. Julia closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. Marcus didn't move. Not until Ella slid her hand into his. Is it done? She whispered. He bent down, pressing his forehead to hers. Yes, baby, he said. It's done. As they walked out of the courtroom, Richard remained seated. He didn't call after them, didn't stand, didn't fight. He simply sat alone, the legacy he once tried to protect, now walking away from him. The next chapter of their lives didn't come with a parade. There were no fireworks, no cinematic victory music playing in the background, just quiet mornings, small routines, and moments that began to stitch themselves into something whole. Ella's world started to bloom. She returned to school full-time, carrying a new backpack with her name stitched in gold thread. She started ballet lessons on Tuesdays and asked Marcus to braid her hair every morning, even though he was comically bad at it. Julia watched those moments from the kitchen table, smiling softly, her tea cooling beside her as she scribbled into a worn journal. One night, while Ella was asleep, Julia and Marcus sat in the living room with the windows open, the breeze whispering through sheer curtains. He had just finished reading an early version of Julia's writing. You kept all of this inside for years, he said, setting the journal down. You've written every version of your pain. I needed to, she said, before it could consume me. He turned toward her. Have you thought about publishing it? She shook her head. Not yet. Right now I just want to be here. With her. With you. Marcus nodded, but he couldn't ignore the feeling growing in him, an urge to do something more permanent, something that would anchor this fragile, beautiful life they were building. Julia, he said carefully, have you thought about what happens next, if your treatment doesn't work? She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. I've started writing her letters, she said, for every birthday, every milestone. In case I don't get to see them. Marcus swallowed hard, emotion rising like a tide. I want her to grow up knowing you, Julia added, not just the father who came later, but the man who stayed. I will, he said fiercely, every step, every year, I promise you. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of mortality lingering between them, but not crushing them, just real, present. And then, softly, Julia said, I'd like to make something official. He turned. I want you to adopt her. Fully, Marcus blinked. You don't have to do that, he said. She's already mine in every way that counts. I know, Julia whispered, but I want her to have your name, legally, emotionally. When I'm gone, I want her to carry the part of us that never broke. He reached for her hand, stunned by the depth of her trust. We'll do it together, he said, not because you're leaving, but because we're staying. That night, he sat by Ella's bed, brushing her hair as she drifted to sleep. She looked up at him through heavy eyelids and whispered, Daddy? Yes, baby. When I grow up, can I still live close to you? He smiled. You can live next door if you want. She grinned sleepily. Okay. Maybe I'll build a tunnel. He laughed quietly and kissed her forehead, and as he watched her fall asleep, he realized this was the life he never planned for, but it was the one he was always meant to live. 3 months later, the courtroom looked entirely different. This time there were no reporters, no opposing legal teams, no threats of injunctions or emergency motions. It was a simple hearing, intimate even. The purpose, finalizing the full adoption of Ella Morgan by Marcus Whitmore. Julia sat beside them in a soft blue dress, her health still fragile, but her eyes brighter than they'd been in months. She clutched a bouquet of small white flowers that Ella had picked that morning, each petal slightly crumpled from how tightly she'd held them. Marcus wore no tie. He hadn't wanted this day to feel formal or cold. He wanted it to feel real. The judge, a different one this time, smiled warmly as she looked over the file. Ella, she said, peering over the rim of her glasses, do you understand what today means? Ella nodded proudly. It means I get to keep him. The judge chuckled gently. That's right. He becomes your daddy forever, even on paper. Ella reached out and took Marcus's hand. He already is. The judge turned to Marcus. Mr. Whitmore, do you understand the full scope of legal guardianship and adoption responsibilities? I do, Marcus said, but I understood it long before the paperwork. The judge's expression softened. Well, I don't often say this, but this is one of the easiest rulings I've ever had the privilege to make. She stamped the final form, signed her name, and looked up. Congratulations. It's official. There was a small cheer from Melissa in the back row. The staff clapped politely. Julia's eyes welled up, and Ella jumped out of her seat and threw her arms around Marcus's neck. I'm yours now, she whispered into his ear. He held her tightly. You always were. After the ceremony, they stepped outside into the soft spring sunlight. Julia leaned into Marcus as they walked toward the car, Ella skipping ahead. I never thought I'd live to see this, Julia said. He looked at her. You gave her a life. You gave me one too. She touched his cheek. Just keep loving her. That's all I'll ever ask. He nodded. I'll never stop. That afternoon, they had a quiet celebration at home. Just the three of them. Cake, laughter, and a framed copy of the adoption certificate hung in Ella's room, decorated with glitter stickers and a hand-drawn heart around the word Whitmore. As the sun set, Julia sat in the garden watching Ella draw chalk designs on the stone patio. Marcus joined her, handing her a cup of chamomile tea. "She said she wants to build a treehouse," Julia said with a smile, "with secret codes and a no grown-ups policy." Marcus chuckled. "I'll bribe my way in with snacks." Julia turned serious for a moment. "You'll keep her wild, right? Brave?" He looked at her, nodding slowly. "With everything I have." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then I can rest." They sat there until stars appeared overhead, and Ella, covered in chalk and dandelion petals, ran up to them and said, "Let's stay out here forever." And Marcus thought, maybe we already are. Summer arrived gently, wrapping their days in sunlight and slow moments. Julia's condition had stabilized. The experimental treatment hadn't cured her, but it gave her time, real time. Enough to see Ella perform in her first ballet recital, enough to wake up to the smell of pancakes on Saturdays, enough to fall asleep with Marcus reading to both of them from old books no one had touched in years. One afternoon, Marcus took Ella to visit his mother's grave. They brought a bouquet of lavender and a letter Ella had written on her own. "She helped us," Ella said, staring at the name carved in stone. "Even though I never met her." Marcus nodded, kneeling beside her. "She would have loved you." Ella placed her drawing on the base of the grave. It showed a smiling woman holding hands with a smaller girl, with the word "thank you" scribbled across the top. Marcus stayed quiet for a moment. "I didn't always understand her," he said softly. "She was quiet, soft-spoken, but strong in ways I only understand now." He looked at Ella, and she knew something I didn't. "What's that?" "That someday I'd be someone worth fighting for, worth becoming." Ella leaned into his side, and in the silence that followed, Marcus felt something shift again, something final. Not an ending, but a quiet closing of a chapter. That night, back at home, Julia sat at the piano for the first time in months. She had once told Marcus she stopped playing after Ella was born, that it reminded her too much of everything she'd lost. But now her fingers moved slowly across the keys, finding an old melody. Ella joined her, plunking random notes with laughter. Marcus watched from the doorway, his heart so full it ached. Later, when Ella had gone to bed, he found Julia sitting at the kitchen table, her journal open. "I'm going to publish it," she said. "The journal?" She nodded. "Not for sympathy, not for money, just because someone out there needs to know that healing doesn't always come clean. Sometimes it's messy, slow. Sometimes it walks in late, wearing a suit and not knowing he has a daughter." He smiled at that. She took his hand across the table. "You saved us, Marcus, all of us." He shook his head. "You brought her to me." "I didn't do it for you," she said gently. "I did it because she deserved to know she was never a mistake." He looked down. "I spent so long thinking love was weakness." "It's not," she said. "It's a choice. The hardest one." He looked at her, his voice steady. "I'd choose it again. I'd choose you again." Tears filled her eyes. "I'd choose us." They sat there in the glow of the kitchen light, hands intertwined, as quiet music drifted from Ella's room, her lullaby playlist still playing on a loop. And Marcus thought about everything they had built. Not a perfect family, but a real one. A family born from brokenness, from absence, from choices too painful to name, and healed by presence, by words, by time, by love. The final letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning. It was tucked in a white envelope with no return address, resting at the edge of Marcus's desk like a forgotten whisper. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Sharp, deliberate, familiar. Richard Whitmore. Marcus hesitated before opening it, unsure if anything this man had to say could still matter. But something in him, perhaps the son who still bore the echo of his father's voice, needed to read it. Inside, the letter was short. No apology, no admission of guilt. Just a few stark sentences. You chose a different legacy, one built on love, not control. Perhaps that will serve you better than it served me. I won't interfere again, not because I've changed, but because she already has. R. Marcus read it twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer, not because he needed to hold on to it, but because it was over. That afternoon he picked up Ella from school. She ran into his arms, her backpack bouncing behind her, face flushed with excitement. "Daddy, guess what?" she said breathlessly. "I won the writing contest. My story's going in the school newspaper." He smiled, hoisting her up. "What's it about?" She grinned. "A little girl who finds her family in the most unexpected place." "Sounds familiar." She nodded, then added, "I wrote that love makes you brave, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." Marcus looked at her, heart swelling. "I think you're the bravest person I know." Back at home, Julia waited with warm cider and a new stack of letters she'd started writing again, this time not for when she was gone, but for the life she was living now. They sat together on the balcony, watching the leaves fall in golden spirals. Marcus wrapped an arm around her as Ella danced below in the yard, collecting leaves for her secret tunnel project she still hadn't given up on. Julia looked at him, quiet and content. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I never brought her to your office that night?" He did, often. But he never said it aloud. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, "I think everything would have been quieter, easier, and I would have missed the best thing that ever happened to me." She smiled. "Even with the chaos?" He nodded. "Especially because of it." As twilight settled over the city, Marcus looked around, at Julia, at Ella, at the life built not from perfection, but persistence. And he understood something clearly. Legacy wasn't built in boardrooms or courtrooms. It was built in bedtime stories, in whispered promises, in the quiet everyday choices to show up when it mattered most. And this legacy, the one he never planned for, was his greatest victory. Forever.